Well, good evening and welcome to the Reagan Library. My name is David Trulio and it is my privilege to serve as President and CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. As many of you know well, we start all of our official programming with a Pledge of Allegiance, so I'm going to ask that you please stand and join me in honoring the flag and all those who serve under it. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, imagine, if you would, a Washington, D.C. based job. It's a very prestigious job. It involves operating at the highest levels of government and society, including with top elected officials and world leaders. It draws an intense national and international spotlight and scrutiny. But as our three special guests here today point out, that job has no salary, no rule book, and no constitutional or elected basis. In fact, speaking about her own role, First Lady Grace Coolidge once said, quote, "My personal likes and dislikes must be subordinated to the consideration of those things which were required," unquote, of the role of First Lady. Well, we are very fortunate to have with us three remarkable authors who collectively have made a significant contribution to understanding the profoundly influential role of First Lady of the United States. So we have Diana Carlin. She is Professor Emerita of Communication at St. Louis University and a retired Professor of Communication Studies at the University of Kansas. She is a founding member and Vice President of the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, and she has taught courses on and written about First Ladies for 30 years. Let's give a hand to Diana. Anita McBride is Executive in Residence at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at the School of Public Affairs at American University in Washington, D.C. Ms. McBride directs programming and national conferences on the legacies of America's First Ladies and their historical influence on politics, policy, and global diplomacy. Her White House service spans 2 decades and 3 presidential administrations, that of George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan. Among Ms. McBride's public service highlights, and which are very relevant to tonight's topic, she served as assistant to President George W. Bush and chief of staff to First Lady Laura Bush from 2005 to 2009, directing the staff's work on the wide variety of domestic and global initiatives in which Mrs. Bush was involved. Let's give a hand to Anita McBride. Nancy Kegan Smith started her career as an archivist at the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, and retired in 2012 as director of the Presidential Materials Division in Washington, D.C., the division at the National Archives and Records Administration, many call it NARA, that advised the White House on presidential and First Lady records and gift issues. She is currently president and a founding member of the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, and lectures and writes on presidential records and First Ladies, including Lady Bird Johnson and Michelle Obama. Let's give a hand to Nancy. It's worth invoking the words of President Harry Truman. He once said, "I hope someday someone will take the time to evaluate the true role of the wife of a president and to assess the many burdens she has to bear and contributions she makes." Let there be no doubt that that day is here with the publication of Remember the First Ladies. So please join me in welcoming Diana, Anita, and Nancy here on our stage.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you.
Well, there are a number of memoirs, biographies, plenty of historical documentaries, none perhaps as rigorous as yours, but what prompted you to say, we should collaborate on a book and we should write this book? What was the impetus for that?
Okay, the impetus was I taught courses in this area for 30 years at a couple different universities, but I never had a textbook. And I've written several textbooks, and about 6 years ago, a publisher contacted me and said, "Do you have an idea for a textbook? Would you like to write one?" I was I was an associate provost at St. Louis University, a 60-hour-a-week job. I said, I don't have time. So when I retired, they came back and said, do you have time now to write a book, and what would you like to write about? And I said, First Ladies. There are all these courses being developed. There is no textbook. We all have to cobble things together. And they came back after I made the proposal and said, this is great. When can you get started? And I said, well, I have 2 other people I want to write with me. They said, okay, who are they? And I gave their backgrounds, and they said, yeah, I think they would be appropriate co-authors. So we signed a contract in December. It was 3 years ago in December, so it's been almost 3.5 years ago that this all started. And it ended up with this book, which is the blue book as opposed to the red book that you're all going to hear about more tonight. And so this is the first ever textbook on First Ladies. And it came out last August. And we've been using, it's being used already in several universities. And what we really like about it is that the publisher, which is Cognella.
Who I think is here. May I ask?
Oh,
if
yes.
our
There she is.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
yes,
you.
Thank you. Glad to have you here. Well, I'm going to give a little pitch for Cognella.
Yeah.
What we loved about it was that they let us test it. Whoops, I just lost my mic. They let us test it on about 5 different groups of students before we finalized it, and they gave us a tremendous amount of input. And then they also will curate it. So if somebody's only teaching a 4-week unit, they can pick and choose, and they will put together what they want. But part of what we wanted to do with this book that makes it different, then our first editor loved it and said, why didn't we learn any of this? So would you be willing to do a trade book, a general public book? And we said, absolutely. We need people to know this. And our students, too, said, everybody needs to learn this because we're not getting it in school. And I think what distinguishes us, David, from all of those memoirs and individual biographies is we start with Martha Washington, and we cover every wife. We don't do the sisters and the daughters-in-law.
Surrogates, yeah.
We do the wives because they are the important ones who are right next to the president, all the way up to Jill Biden, and she gave us an interview for the book. And so we've covered all of them. There are some books that may have biographies of all of them, that they're all written by different people. They're edited. So you have 3 consistent voices. We also set the historical context, the political times, what's going on with women. We even look into their marriages and kind of what that background is. And we look at the role of First Lady from Martha Washington to Jill Biden to see what stayed the same, what's changed. And no one else has really done anything that way with a single voice.
Plus
which,
the themes.
with the
in
theme.
book.
And then we have thematic chapters. We introduce them all. We get a sense of what this position is like. And then we look at certain areas really with a nice microscope.
Well, I'm going to ask a question, and I don't agree with the premise of the question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So what do you say to maybe critics or maybe some cynical people who claim that First Ladies are merely spouses of presidents? Why do they deserve serious attention by historians, by political scientists, or serious scholars?
I'll start with this. I think, these women have all been independent players in our history. And we talk a lot about inclusive history in our country. And we cannot talk about our history without including these women and the role that they have played. And you'll see in the book, again, through the thematic chapters that we examine, where they have really provided so much influence, advice to their husbands, help to move the country forth on certain issues, including women's rights, including always pushing for education, including representing us globally around the world. Again, it's our history. They are a part of our history. We were so encouraged by the response of the students when we tested the textbook that all said the same thing when they read this chapter by chapter. Why did we never learn this before? So we know we were filling a gap in academic literature, and we think it's translated beautifully into this book as well.
Well, and Anita, when you were Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush, tell us, how many countries did you travel to?
Well, she did 77 in 8 years, but I did 67 of those with her.
So just let that sink
4.
in, right? 60
We were very
to
busy.
70 countries.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And then we had a chance to speak earlier, And sometimes first ladies are more popular than their husbands, right?
Sure.
So as we think of tools of statecraft and also ways to shape perceptions of what's happening, first ladies play a crucial role there.
Well, they
Well-
certainly do, but I'll mention one thing, and then Nancy, I'll turn this over to you. I think let's remember the fact that every single problem in the world comes to the desk of the American president. 50% of the time or more, they are not going to make people happy, and their decisions can be tough and unpopular. First ladies do sort of rise above that. They are political actors, but they really do rise above the politics, and that helps a president and his administration, but it does lend itself to a first lady oftentimes being more popular.
I think that Mrs. Johnson defined it very well when she said it was the journey of their heart. So the first ladies that are really successful and that their projects are last way after they leave the first lady time period, have really followed their hearts, their passions, and literacy,
legacies.
education, the environment. And then the modern first ladies have set up foundations that people are not really that aware of. Barbara Bush's Literacy Foundation raised over $100 million, and it affects individual people so much. The Wildflower Center has now, Mrs. Johnson's Wildflower Center has now gone into broader environmental issues. Laura Bush has multiple foundations dealing with reading
Libraries
and nature. It is just amazing what the concrete and substantive issues that these ladies have addressed.
And I'd add one other thing. Oftentimes, these men would not be sitting in the White House if it hadn't been for their wives.
Right.
They often were wealthier, they were better educated, they were politically connected better than their husbands. You know, Abraham Lincoln is a very good example of that. Sarah Polk was incredibly, connected well. Truman, and Lady Bird borrowed money from her inheritance so that LBJ could run the first time. And, Martha had far more money than George did and enabled him to do everything before the war. And, they took some of the rough edges off of them. Andrew Johnson's wife taught him public speaking and got him into a debate society. So when you go down the list, they were incredibly influential in making these men who they were.
Well, to understand the present and the future, can you help us understand the origins of this whole concept of the First Lady? Maybe take us back to Martha Washington or Abigail Adams or Dolly Madison. How did they establish important precedents? How did this all come together?
Well, Martha, of course, was the one to step in the undefined role with no rule book. We had effectively breaking away from the Great Britain, and so she had to define, with Washington's help, being regal but not too regal, an American sort of head of state, and she did that beautifully. When Washington became president, he very much realized that it was a two-person job, that the social and ceremonial component, he would depend on Martha for a lot, and she had a tremendous background in entertaining in Virginia, being a hostess, and it took her a few months to join him in New York, and when she did, she was very surprised to find that her role had been defined by his staff and by George Washington. And she was to do receptions and to make visits, but she couldn't return visits. And she was very upset about that and wrote the letter where she said she was like a prisoner. Now later she broke out of that. So he would do entertaining with men. He would join her for her receptions and entertainment, and they were more informal and she was very savvy at showcasing George Washington, who could be stiff in a slightly more informal capacity. The one negative thing about Martha, and these are human beings with the full variety of qualities, was that she did bring slavery into the White House. Then you have Abigail Adams from Massachusetts, very different world. Grew up as a congregational minister's daughter, really encouraged to share her opinions, and Abigail did share her opinions. And John liked it, although the first time John met Abigail, she was young, and he did not have a good impression of her. He said, not frank, not kind, and he clearly changed it very quickly. Abigail was a great promoter of women's rights, and when John was in the Continental Congress and they were drafting the Constitution, she said, please remember the women and be kinder to them than your ancestors. Well, he read that to some friends, but it didn't end up in the Constitution. And when he became president, she was his closest advisor. She was only with him for half of the time, but their letters back and forth are truly incredible. They're at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The archives has put some on Founders Online, and they're incredible not only in that you can know what was going on during the presidency, but they are an incredible record of the founding of the nation. Abigail, too, had her faults. She was very anti-French at a time when it was becoming factional. She was a Federalist, believed in stronger government, and she encouraged John to sign the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it criminal to criticize the president or to, was very tough on immigrants. And Jefferson so disliked it, he took up, he was the vice president and went back to Monticello, and many people feel that Adams did not get reelected because of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And then we get to Dolly, and Dolly is so incredible in really stretching and bringing forward the social role. She made it bipartisan. She included foes of her husband, friends. Her receptions were so big they were called squeezes because you really had to squeeze through.
Into the room.
And she was a wonderful asset to her husband because Madison was about 5'6". He was an introvert, wore black suits, and here was Dolly, much taller. She wore French clothes and turbans and had an amazing ability to make every man think that he was the most interesting man she had met. So men loved Dolly. And Madison.
And can I just jump in? There's a significant street or avenue in Northern Virginia named after Dolly Madison.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
And she helped in the War of 1812, she did a really important thing.
Yes.
She saved the Gilbert Stuart portrait when the British were descending on the White House. She was actually going to have a reception, and the dinner table was set. And she saved the Gilbert Stuart portrait, but she also saved some very important government documents. But she was so brave, and it was in such a short time that when the British came, they saw the tables were set for dinner.
And they ate it.
And they ate it.
And then they burned the White House.
And then they burned
the White House.
Yeah.
And when Dolly died, she was so popular. She had the largest state funeral. Washington closed down, and Zachary Taylor called her our First Lady, which is where the term began, but it didn't start being used as the term for ladies.
Until about the 1880s.
1890s.
Well, and your book has some fascinating details, among them the differences between the sort of culture of Southern entertaining versus the New England culture and how that affected the early occupants of this role. So
Sure.
I recommend it to everyone. Well, so let's fast forward. How did the role evolve further? You know, there subsequently was the creation of an office of the First Lady, which is an office in the East Wing of the White House. So maybe Anita, could you start us
Sure.
off on how it evolved?
Sure. Well, the First Lady to actually hire a formal staff position was Edith Roosevelt. So this is not until 1901. Prior to that, you know, our first 10 first families had slaves in the White House, and so there were servants who tended, of course, to the First Lady and the First Family, and the President as well. But the First Lady never had staff. Well, Mrs. Roosevelt comes in 1901 with 5 very rambunctious children and a busy social calendar that she was expected to oversee, and she needed help. So she prevailed upon her husband to have a budget for a position, and the first position was a social secretary. And it really remained that way for a very, very long time. And let's remember, too, there was no office for the First Lady. And the President, too, worked out of the residence of the White House up until this time. This was one push forward for the White House that she helped to do, was to really force the building of an executive wing, which as we now know is the West Wing, and then the Oval Office was added later. So now the residence was their private space. She's working out of her dressing room. So are most First Ladies, really up until an East Wing was built in 1942, and then actually begun in 1942 and finished in 1945. But the First Lady to actually have an office in the East Wing was not until Rosalind Carter. So we're in 1978. Prior to this, or 1976, prior to this, First Ladies, again, as I said, are working out of their dressing room. Lou Hoover would have her papers all on the bed, and Mrs. Eisenhower actually, because of some of her health issues, would work out of her bed, out of her bedroom. Mrs. Johnson did too. But Mrs. Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy, was the first to hire a position that was called the Assistant Social Secretary for Press Relations. So we started to formalize a little bit of a connection for a First Lady and the media in a formal way. But she gave her Assistant for Press Relations this direction: give the press as little as possible, but do it in a nice way. She just, was reticent about the press intruding on her too much. Mrs. Johnson formalized that role of press secretary and actually hired a professional member of the media and longtime friend of the Johnsons to serve in that role. But it was Mrs. Carter who really changed things by professionalizing the office with more positions. A policy director included a precursor to a chief of staff. Mrs. Reagan was the first to name a chief of staff to the First Lady, elevated the position to be a commissioned officer in the White House. So things were changing, but really it's back to Mrs. Carter, put a structure in place which really governs the office to this day.
As all might expect, we are going to talk a fair amount about Mrs. Reagan
Yes.
in the course of our discussion. But I do want to underscore what you said about the significance of having a chief of staff, because in the White House environment, that's a big deal. And now this person is a White House staffer, not somebody off on the side working for somebody, but this is somebody in the official White House hierarchy.
And is recognized, that way. Although even to this day, anyone who works for the office of First Lady is still a staff member of the President assigned to the First Lady.
The executive office of the President.
It's right, and going back to the fact that this is not the elected official. They're really not, there's no statutory authority for them. So this is the President's staff, and they're assigned to the First Lady.
Does your research or your own direct experience explain what prompted Mrs. Reagan to make that next leap to having a chief of staff? I mean, you yourself were a chief of staff.
Right, I'm very grateful for Mrs. Reagan to establish that role because I ended up serving in it as well. I think, you know, I'm not sure that we uncovered a specific reason for that. I think that she
It's just the
came
further
in
professionalization.
and really,
yeah.
further professionalization of the role, and then that is a structure that has never changed. But that was a big leap to make it a commissioned officer. In the White House, there is a hierarchy of presidential staff, as David knows, served in the White House too, and she brought this person in right in the middle level, which was significant.
Well, so as this maturation continues, if you would share with us, when did they start having official policy initiatives? And how did that work out? Which were successful, maybe not successful? Maybe Nancy?
Well, it really, I mean, you can sort of peg it to Eleanor Roosevelt, who, of course, created the activist model for a First Lady, except Eleanor was into everything. So she really didn't dovetail into one or two or three issues. You couldn't do that with Eleanor. So then the next First Lady that did focus on an issue was Jackie Kennedy in terms of White House restoration.
Right.
And interestingly enough, that was an issue that her husband and his staff did not want her focusing on. They thought it looked too
Elitist.
regal, too elitist, but she did a wonderful job. And then after the assassination, when Mrs. Johnson came in, she was asked by Mrs. Kennedy, and this is the only time that we know of this, on November 26th, 3 days after the assassination,
After the
Mrs.
funeral.
Kennedy still had was staying in the White House, and she had Mrs. Johnson to a T. And Mrs. Johnson thought it would be about household stuff. No, no, no. Jackie Kennedy, dressed in beautiful gloves, a suit, all of that, said that she wanted Mrs. Johnson to continue, and she wanted it to be made permanent, her White House restoration efforts. So, of course, Mrs. Johnson was delighted to do that, and President Johnson passed an executive order making the Committee for the Preservation of the White House a permanent entity that the First Lady chairs. It still exists today, and added a curator as a permanent position. So that was sort of an unknown to Mrs. Johnson because that wasn't what she thought her first project would be. Her first project, of course, was beautification. Mrs. Johnson loved the environment. She wanted to call it the environment. No, the president's staff thought it was too substantive to use the word environment, so they gave her beautification. To the day she died, Mrs. Johnson hated the term beautification. But anyway, she did beautification. She did it both in Washington, D.C. She supported a highway beautification, and she did it all over the nation. And then civil rights, she was the first solo campaigner of a First Lady. In October of '64, goes on a 4-day trip through the South, and she tells her staff not to places that the big cities. I want to go to the small cities. And she campaigned for civil rights from Alexandria, Virginia to New Orleans, and was credited with 3 southern states going Democratic in the 1964 election, when President Johnson feared, because of the Civil Rights Act, that the Democrats would bolt the Democratic Party. So Mrs. Johnson starts that Head Start, and then it goes on to Mrs. Ford, and it's now developed. And Diana, do you want to talk about it?
Well, let me back up a little bit, though. Even though this Lady Bird, Eleanor, but Lady Bird really with a specific cause, you can go back to Martha. Martha took veterans and military as a cause. She used her own money, and her letters to friends talk about everything she's doing to support widows and veterans. and she would let any veteran in at any time. And that has been a theme that is consistent all the way to our current First Lady.
Yes.
Right.
And it's not just during wartime, but we have had First Ladies who have tended to veterans since Martha. Dolly supported orphanages
Right.
in
Yes.
Washington, D.C. And you can see a lot of these early First Ladies that did have causes, but because they were doing it sort of informally and often with their own funds. Frances, goodness, why am I-
Cleveland.
Yes, Cleveland. She had a bunch of charities that she supported mainly with her own. And one of the most interesting ones is Caroline
By
Harrison,
right.
Benjamin Harrison's wife. She came from a family that believed in education for women. Her father started basically a women's college. She was extremely well educated. Johns Hopkins Medical School asked her to raise money for them. And she said she would be happy to do it, but only if they would start admitting women to
Right.
their medical school, and they did, and she helped raise money. So education, but it was never got the attention or was, definitely a platform like some of these others.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't announced.
And it wasn't announced. They
and,
did.
and then Betty Ford,
Yeah,
course.
and
ERA.
Betty Ford with the ERA was probably one of the
And
most.
Pat Nixon, too.
Yeah,
who
oh,
also
yeah,
supported
Pat
the
supported the ERA.
Very underreported and underappreciated
and
First Lady.
volunteerism
And
for Pat
volunteerism.
Nixon.
So you really, once Lady Bird put this in play, then you began seeing Pat labeling volunteerism, ERA. But Betty Ford really pushed the ERA to the point that the staff was not happy with her, and probably the president not all the time either, because she was getting a lot of criticism, especially because she was calling state legislators. They needed to ratify the ERA, and who ratifies it? State legislatures. So they told her she could not be using government phones to make these calls. So she paid to have her own line put into the White House and to make her calls. And there's a picture of her with the desk, and she has a "Don't Tread on Me" flag in front of that desk,
Right.
which was a very powerful statement. And she made calls to all the states that were considering it.
I
And
think-
then also breast cancer, which Nancy
Right.
Reagan was also very involved
I'd
in.
like to add about Rosalind Carter, because I think at Mrs. Carter's funeral back in November, I think people were really surprised
Nice.
about how much they learned about what she did and what she accomplished as First Lady, and also as First Lady of the state of Georgia, which the governor, her husband, had handed her a responsibility to oversee the governor's commission on mental health. And she fully thought that that would be a project she would work on the national level, and President Carter wanted her to. There were a couple of things that were obstacles in her way. Number one, at the time, the government really didn't allow for the president to give a formal role to a member of his family. So that was an obstacle she had to oversee, and the result was she had to be called honorary chair of a commission, not chair of the commission. And she didn't like that, because she thought that that conveyed someone who goes around cutting ribbons and wasn't really involved in the depth and the substance of which she was very, very, very knowledgeable. The other huge problem that she had, and this goes back to staff, is, her husband campaigned on cutting the size of the White House staff, and she is pleading with him for staff. And in both of their memoirs, they both talk about this was the issue of which they had the most arguments about as husband and wife. He knew he needed her, but also this was a campaign promise that he had to be very careful to not overdo.
I think it shows a lot. We just did a conference at the Ford Museum on First Ladies, and we showed pictures of the conference in 1984 that Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter talking. And Rosalind tells this fascinating story that once President Carter was the president-elect, she was asked at one of the campaign stops what she was going to do, and she said, well, I'm going to head up the Commission on Mental Health. And then Rosalind says she went home and told Jimmy that's what she was doing. So it shows you the good relationship
That
she
they
had
had.
with Jimmy.
The other thing I think that relates to these causes, just goes back to the beautification, that Mrs. Carter found out about. They had this big rollout of the Mental Health Commission. She's the honorary chair. They have a big news conference. And when she finishes, they start asking her questions about why did they decide to only serve wine and not hard liquor at the
In the
White
White
House.
House.
And she was just
So
furious.
frustrated.
And she was going all over the country having hearings. She testified before Congress. The second First Lady, Eleanor was the first. And once again, they didn't take it seriously. It wasn't a sexy topic. And that's and the beautification, once again, you have to kind of marginalize. So these first ladies have all sort of fought this, and Jackie Kennedy worried about it being elitist, and Nancy Reagan with Just Say No. People criticized that term, and it's like, isn't this pretty
Well,
simplistic?
let's dive into Mrs.
Yeah.
Reagan. That's a
Yes.
great segue.
Yeah.
So, share with us, if you would, what are your views on how Mrs. Reagan handled her responsibilities over 8 years, which is a very considerable amount of time. Where did she lead society's thinking? Where did she have challenges?
Can I?
Sure,
Right,
go ahead.
Well, I think that she came in and she was, of course, Californian actress, very used to dealing in the California press world. And she came in, and she was the governor's wife. And she came into the Washington world, which is quite different. And she was the first to say this. And she had a very tough first year. She was criticized for getting private White House china. Just all she wanted to do was get a complete state dinner set. And she was not using public money to do that. Very similar to things Jackie Kennedy did, and they were outraged. She was criticized.
Why? I mean, can you help us understand that? So, just to restate it,
Right.
private funds were used
Yes.
to
Right.
buy
Not a single
an
penny of
expensive
them.
china set for use by the president and
Right.
Mrs. Reagan's guests, but no tax dollars were used.
No.
No, it was the White House Historical Association. Let's
Right.
back up for a second, because this is a legacy of Jackie Kennedy establishing the White House Historical Association in 1961 to be the private funding arm of any acquisitions, collections, portraits, renovations, restorations of anything at the White House, because Jackie Kennedy knew there would never, ever be enough government money to maintain the White House at the museum quality that it deserves. So this is a structure that's in place. Mrs. Reagan comes in and is taking advantage of a structure that is in place, private
and
money
is raising
that was
a
raised.
lot of
And
money.
is raising a lot of money. She also raised a lot of money to help restore Blair House. These are things that she really did leave behind. But the country, the country was in a recession. And so that was, again, the overlay of what was going on. And she, comes to Washington as a glamorous first lady. People had to adapt to that change. And, and given what they had for the previous 4 years was, with the Carters, was much more simplistic. So her attempt at glamorizing the White House, even though Jackie Kennedy did the same thing and was revered for it, Mrs. Reagan was in some ways unfairly criticized.
She was really criticized. Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, said that she told Mrs. Reagan she felt she was being criticized because Mrs. Reagan wasn't fitting the current feminist concept at the time. I mean, my God, she looked adoringly at her husband, and the press criticized that,
Right.
the
Yeah.
Nancy
have
Reagan
a good-
stare.
Yeah,
You
I
have a
think
good-
this is really an inflection point in the 80s. We'd had the feminism really hitting its high point in the late 60s, early 70s. The younger women thought that the model of the First Lady should change. One of the things that the First Lady's always been described at was to be the ideal American woman. She was supposed to be the role model. So Nancy Reagan is of the World War II generation. Those were the wives who gave up their careers, stayed home, and the ones who worked during the war. When the men came back, they were told, give up the job so that a veteran can have it. And, you know, it was the beaver-cleaver approach. So she was criticized for being out of sync by the younger women. And at the same time, you were beginning to have a backlash from more conservative women, the total woman, Maribel Morgan, I don't know if you remember some of those, you know, greet your husband in saran wrap at the door kind of thing, if anybody remembers that one. But so you have this interesting inflection of, you know, the kind of what should the American woman be? And since the First Lady is the model, it's this struggle, you know, in society about what Nancy Reagan should and shouldn't be doing. And quite frankly, I think she was a wonderful blend of the old and the new.
Yes.
Because she had been a career woman. She was involved in important issues. She had her causes, but yet she was there for her husband. And that is what every spouse really had as their primary responsibility,
Right.
to do what they could to help their husband.
Well,
Absolutely.
and if I could say, in this crisis on the China, you can see the sisterhood of First Ladies playing, because Jackie Kennedy Onassis called her and said, with sympathy and advice, saying, quote, all of this would pass, but it might be a good idea to quit reading the papers for a while. And Margaret Truman, Bess Truman's daughter, said, I think it's too bad about this hassle over her doing something she should have done. It's really ridiculous. As for mixing up place settings, all I can say is that looks just awful. When the President and First Lady give a state dinner, the china should match. You know, I mean,
Pretty basic.
Well, your book is rigorously researched, and in keeping with the topic of Mrs. Reagan, there were some very interesting, I don't know if artifacts is the right term, but there was a certain letter to Raisa
Oh,
Gorbachev.
yes.
And then I also want to talk about Just Say No. So could you share with us, in a moment we'll go to Q&A, so please have your questions ready.
Sure.
But there were some really neat
Yes.
elements that your research brought to light.
Yes, sure. The Raisa Gorbachev letter, which Nancy, I think, has
I
some words from the letter.
So this is a letter from the First Lady of the United States to the, I don't know, what is the term for the
Wife
Soviet
of the-
Union's, the General Secretary,
Well,
the
General
General
Secretary.
Secretary's
Gorbachev.
spouse. Yeah,
Yes.
so Raisa Gorbachev.
And Mrs. Reagan, to put it in context, President Reagan, some of his staff were very much against detente. They were very much the dark, evil empire. And Mrs. Reagan was much more pragmatic, and she pushed Ronald Reagan to try to get some peace and to try and work on this. And she writes a letter. First, she says, with the world so dangerous, I felt it was ridiculous for these two heavily armed superpowers to be sitting there and not talking to each other. And then she writes a letter to Reza, and she says that she hopes at Geneva that her two husbands will be able to reach across the bridge and to be successful in limiting arms.
What do we know about the backdrop of how this letter came about? Did she just sit down and write it? Was this socialized with any staff?
I'm sure it was not socialized with any staff.
I think she just wrote it.
Mrs.
You
Reagan
know,
just-
I think
she
that-
was invested in her husband being successful.
And the
in
significance
this.
of that is you have to believe the Soviets analyzed every single word
Absolutely.
word choice
Yeah.
to try and figure out what message was being sent.
Right.
So this got really noticed,
And
undoubtedly.
what's interesting about this, though, is the relationship, of course, between these two women was not very warm. I mean,
It was the Cold
very,
War.
very difficult, and personally, and Mrs. Gorbachev was never very kind to Mrs. Reagan either, and that was palpable. But Mrs. Reagan had a bigger goal in mind. She knew what her husband wanted to accomplish. She felt he could accomplish it and really be the one person to change the dynamic that we had all known in our country for decades in the Cold War, is to turn that around. So she, whatever feelings she may have had about Mrs. Gorbachev, she did not let that get in the way of the end game.
Diana?
And she understood, she was incredibly politically savvy.
Yes.
And at one of probably the G7 or whatever, Margaret Thatcher had told her that she thought Gorbachev, and had told the president, is a very different kind of leader. And this is maybe someone that we can finally do something with.
Do business with.
But they need to begin to get to know one another. So Karen Tumulty's book, I think, actually starts with
Triumph
that
of
dinner.
Nancy Reagan.
Nancy Reagan. It's a fabulous book. I could not put it down. But Nancy wanted that meeting to not just be covered by the media and be the typical kind of thing with all the staff. So she had George Shultz, who'd just been appointed Secretary of State, on a snowy night when Washington was shut down. They sent a car for him and his wife to have dinner in the private quarters with just the two of them. And she told him about this conversation and said, when they go, they need time with no staff, the two of them to get to know one another. And that's what they did. And every time they met, they had that. And she was the one who, when they went to Moscow and were in Red Square, and remember they got out and walked around? It's her idea. She wanted them to see the Americans and to greet them. So she really understood that it was going to take a different approach and that it was going to be a more interpersonal, human-to-human approach. And she said a lot of that in
Well, and this example really underscores the broader point your book makes about the profound influence of this role, right? So, literally the entire course of that relationship, and therefore even world history, if you extrapolate it out, was shaped by these very specific decisions.
And behind the scenes decisions, our first ladies had influence on their husbands and their work. If I can just do the one example of Edith Roosevelt, this is during the time of the Russo-Japanese War, and President Teddy Roosevelt is trying to negotiate a peaceful end to this. It was Edith Roosevelt that was a back channel of communications between a British diplomat in St. Petersburg and her husband, of what exactly was going on in the ground, in Russia, valuable information that he used in the negotiate peaceful end to the war. And the irony of all this is, there is, in the Roosevelt room, as you know, the first Nobel Peace Prize ever given to an American president is to Teddy Roosevelt. And here's Edith Roosevelt that has been, working in the background to help make that a reality.
Can I
Again,
tell
this
the
diplomacy.
Roosevelt story?
No,
don't.
no,
Okay.
because he was probably
Very
watching.
quickly, if we may, Just Say No and Nancy Reagan's anti-drug campaign. You researched that quite vigorously. Anything from the archives you care to share about that?
Well, what we love is that Mrs. Reagan, of course, who believed so passionately about this issue and that drugs was really hurting our country and hurting our young people so badly. She's the first lady to address the United Nations. And it was on this issue. She had held conferences with other first ladies, particularly from Latin and Central America, about the issue of drugs. She really hits hard on her speech. Nancy has it there. I don't know if you want to say a word or two from it, but really hits hard on these cartels in these South American countries and how they were destroying their countries, and that this was coming into our country as well, and that people had to come together to do something about it. And it showed incredible leadership and passion around an issue that she knew was really hurting our nation and hurting our nation's kids.
It really did. It was in 1987, October of 1987. And what she did that was also very interesting is she went against U.S. policy. And she criticized, she said the United States could do more. And that was really gutsy. And
Because of the drug market in the United States drawing it
yes.
Right.
And so that is just one. And then her Just Say No campaign was extremely effective. And Joe Califano, who was Secretary of Education for Jimmy Carter and health aide for President Johnson, and said she was incredibly
Really effective.
on trying to control drugs for
trying to
These are very
educate
clearly
young
not
people.
Republicans praising her.
Right,
Right,
exactly.
And the other thing, she knew how to, once she got past her problems, and did the secondhand rose at the Gridiron Club, where she completely changed people's
View of
opinions
her.
of her because she laughed at herself. She then knew how to use the media. And so she went on Different Strokes
A show.
and Gary Coleman, and he comes home from school, and there's a drug problem going on, and she comes in, and she's in their living room.
That was a popular culture
By the
show
way,
at the
let's
time.
just pause. That's amazing that a First Lady of the United
Yeah.
States would go on a major,
Yeah.
was it
It was a
network,
sitcom.
network
Popular
sitcom?
It was a
Yeah.
network
network
sitcom.
sitcom,
Yeah.
and be part of that, and
Yeah.
and probably a third of the country saw that
Yeah.
or something.
And
Exactly.
then she also, the PBS, the Chemical People documentary
Right.
that was looking at the drug problem. You know, she was involved with that. She was on all the major news stories when she really kicked off all of this. So she knew how to use the typical news. She knew how to use popular culture. She was masterful.
Well,
at all
and
that.
this underscores one of the broader points of your book, that the influence, because no elected leader could actually probably get on a primetime show, right?
Yeah,
The-
or
the-
a host.
The
She was
fact
a-
that she
she
was
was a
not
host.
elected.
Yeah.
She was a
Yes.
host of a morning show
Right.
for an
Yeah,
hour
yes.
about
Right.
about drugs and
Yeah.
the problem of drugs in America. Exactly, to your
And
point,
she
David.
said in her memoir that her work on drugs was one of the most fulfilling
Yeah.
times of her life.
Great.
You know, she really felt that she was helping people.
And-
Great. Well, let's,
Yeah. No, I was
unless you'd
gonna
like
say,
to
and
finish
one
your
of the
thought,
things
we'll
we
go to
do-
questions.
Yeah, do talk about in the book is we researched numbers. So, that chapter has some information about usage and those kids who started in kindergarten, that there actually was a reduction over time. So there is some data that supports that it was very successful.
Okay, let's go to questions. We have a microphone, and if folks don't want to ask questions, I will call on people. I'm
Got
just
one
kidding.
right here.
We have a question over there.
Thank you so much for speaking. What are we going to share with our daughters as they're getting older and they understand all of this beautiful information that you've shared, and they'll read your book? We have 3 daughters. What will they remember about our more recent first ladies in the last 12 to 16 years?
Well, I hope they'll look at what these women have done with the platform for which they have been given, of which, honestly, they didn't have to do and pick or choose anything to do. But they really felt a sense of responsibility and obligation to use this role, this powerful platform that they're given. And look at some of the examples of things that they have tried to do. You've said in the last 12 years. I'll speak to the time I had with Mrs. Bush. She was a very quiet, understated woman. She didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room, but she was very impactful. And she found a way to use her voice, her background, her experiences on education, on literacy. So did her mother-in-law, and left in place foundations that are tackling some of these very big problems. And in fact, Barbara Bush's Foundation for Family Literacy, we have a terrible problem with adult illiteracy in this country. Well, this foundation has raised over $100 million with programs operating in all 50 states. It's still going on. That is something that I think is an empowering example. You can take an issue you care about, really work hard at it, bring people, around with you to support it, and leave something in place that helps people. Laura Bush, the same thing when she traveled the campaign in 2000 to support her husband running for president. She had been a teacher and a librarian. She went to places where she felt comfortable, and that was schools and libraries during the campaign. And she saw the condition of the lack of collections in a lot of our school libraries, particularly public school libraries. And the minute she became First Lady, that was the first thing she established, is the Laura Bush Foundation for school libraries. And it's still going to this day, raising hundreds of millions of dollars and giving grants out in all 50 states to improve the collections for kids. So again, I think it's just examples of using their own personal backgrounds and experiences and trying to do something to help people.
And anybody who lives in the Washington, D.C. area sees what Mrs. Johnson did for a more beautiful nation's capital. All the plannings, they're still there. If you drive nationally on the highways, you don't see the billboards, although it's coming back more, but you don't see the billboards that you would. And her foundation empowers people to do
Protect the
more
environment.
native plantings. It's amazing. Rosalind Carter's Foundation for Mental Health and Caregivers, it's so important. So I think that for your daughters and for young ladies, it sets such an example. Michelle Obama empowering education in young girls all over the world. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and I think that's this role model idea. You know,
The
these
mentoring.
women, as Nancy said, they're journeys of the heart. They take what they are passionate about, the things that have affected their lives and that they see affect the average American. And so I think, you know, women often think volunteerism isn't that important.
But it is.
Well, this is the biggest volunteer job in the country.
Right,
that a
which
first
is what
lady's
Ronald
doing.
Reagan said. Right.
Yeah, and so, you know, I think young women can see that they can find a way, you know, even in a job, if they have a career, that there's some way they can use that career to promote something within the community. So I think they're just incredible role models for not just women, but men, and how we can really make the most of those things we're passionate about in ways that we don't have to get paid for to do it.
Anita, what was your thought about Ronald Reagan?
No, you know what, he had a quote that I loved. He said, "The American people only get one public servant for free, and that's the First Lady." Yeah.
Great. Well, there was another question over here.
Were there any, there are so many wonderful things that the First Ladies have done, and I was wondering if there was anything that was tried that completely fell flat, and or was there anything that in your research you found out that was very stealthily done that they didn't want to know about, or that the big people didn't want?
So what
Yeah.
failed and what surreptitious initiatives
well-
might there have been out there as well?
Well, I
Hillary-
was going to say, yeah.
Hillary Clinton's health care task force.
Which the president gave her to do.
Do.
Let's understand that, right? Handed her the initiative. But the way it was done, the country wasn't ready, and that failed miserably. And unfortunately, you know, for Mrs. Clinton too, you know, there was a big splash. She put an office in the West Wing. You know, she was overseeing this major policy initiative. It failed. She never used that office in the West Wing again, and basically, you know, recognizes and says in her memoir, if she were to do it all over again, she wouldn't be leading this. She'd be working behind the scenes, helping to facilitate and advocate for healthcare reform, because she really did know a lot about it. She was steeped in knowledge, but she would not have been the front lead because the country was not ready to see a First Lady be leading a policy initiative like that. Policy advocacy
And a
is one
controversial
thing.
one,
It
too.
was
I mean, it
very,
was
Yes.
very
controversial
controversial.
material.
Yes.
So that was, you know, considered a failure.
And there's, it's interesting, Nancy Reagan said she didn't understand the Washington environment, and Hillary Clinton said part of the health care issue was that she came in, she didn't understand the Washington politics, what you could do,
And the
what
media.
and how you got it accomplished.
Right.
So there's sort of a trend there. But certainly she's not the only First Lady who has had an initiative fail. But that is when you ask, that's one of the best
Yeah.
known.
And I think, you know, not wanting credit necessarily, Pat Nixon, we were at Nixon 2 days ago, perfect example. And, you know, she was going all over the world. And how many countries? Like
81, the most
countries
traveled First
until
Lady
Hillary
in
Clinton.
history to that
And,
time.
you know, she didn't really expect as much coverage as what the other president was getting. But the White House, her impact on the White House was amazing, and she didn't want it publicized. Anita, you can kind of add to the
No,
specifics of what she did.
It's true. We think of Jackie Kennedy as the person who's had the most dramatic effect on the preservation of the White House, but it really was Pat Nixon. Under her leadership, more collections were added to the White House under her, more restorations than most people know. But again, she was not given credit for that. And the other problem for Mrs. Nixon, too, and all that she was doing is her husband's staff really made it very, very difficult for her, and did not want her to have a visible and prominent role. And that unfortunately, was very tough for Mrs. Nixon.
Great. Next question. Right here in the front.
Monsignor Connolly.
Oh, right over there. Tricia, you take
You'll
the
be
mic.
next, Monsignor.
You'll come back. You'll come back.
You'll be the next.
I'm curious what your thoughts or plans are for future First Ladies with respect to your book, and what are your thoughts with respect to First Gentlemen?
Yeah.
Well,
We actually, we
We
talk
do.
about the first gentleman in the last chapter. And, we have models. We have a second gentleman now.
right.
And so we're seeing, what he's doing. And Anita always likes to say that, one of the things when he was asked a question about what his role was, he said it was to support the vice president.
Right. Very traditional response.
Very traditional. But we've had lots of women governors. I'm from Kansas. We're on our third woman governor. And, those husbands have all been very different. So we
Right.
have a lot of governors to look at. And this role has never been done exactly the same by any of these women. And that's one of the points we make. They can do with it what they want. And so the first male spouse is going to do with it what he wants, but it's going to be basically to support the president.
Yeah.
And as far as the book, we've got somebody from our publisher here, but we're assuming we're going to have to do an update at some point. And so we will update when it's necessary and, add a new chapter or whatever.
The position does adapt to whoever the occupant is. I think that's the resiliency of our country, too.
Front row.
Desmond.
Was there a First Lady who was less spectacular and maybe more reserved that you can remember? Just
Sure.
we're applauding and canonizing all the ladies you're speaking about. Was there somebody that just didn't measure that level
Yes.
of
Well,
anointing? What do you
Well, understandably, I think we like to talk about one First Lady who really did not have a very visible role, but for good reasons, and Jane Pierce, who really did not want her husband to be president. In fact, she fainted when he was nominated. She just thought the business of politics she was a very pious woman. She thought the business of politics was just terrible and that no good would come of it. And in her life and in their life, that was true. I mean, they lost a couple of children even before getting to the White House, and then another on the way to the inauguration. Very tragic. And then other things happened. I think it was at the inauguration, the vice president got sick, right? Got pneumonia and died within a month of the inauguration. Her predecessor, Mrs. Fillmore, got sick and pneumonia, I think, as well, and died. And so all these tragedies are surrounding them as they're just, starting in the administration. And so she really spent most of her time up in the residence, really in mourning, and other members of her family fulfilled some of the roles. So, we examine that, how she was certainly not an activist in the role, didn't do much to further the role at all, but there's a lot of reasons why, and again, having some grace and compassion for her.
Andrew Johnson's wife, Eliza Johnson, would be another one. She wasn't very happy with the whole situation, and Johnson certainly had a very difficult job. And so she pretty much stayed out of the picture. But when it came time to develop the defense for his impeachment,
Yeah.
she was the one, like I said, who had gotten him started with public speaking and debate. She helped him write his defense. But up until that point, she wasn't doing the hostess thing.
Right.
Kind of stepped back. And there were several others in the early 19th century like that.
Well, and there are many first ladies who were very reluctant about being a first lady. Michelle Obama, when Barack wanted to run, Barack was so scared that Michelle would say no that he went to Craig Robinson,
Her
brother,
brother.
to ask Michelle to lay the way that he was going to want to run. And Michelle
And then,
acquiesced, but to say that she wanted to be a first lady is not correct. Jackie Kennedy hated politics. She hated the smoke, the cigar room, the
Backdoor
Well,
breakfast
and when it
politics.
comes to Mrs. Obama, Nancy Reagan reached out to her. Can you tell us quickly
Yes,
about
and
that?
Mrs. Obama invited Mrs. Reagan to the White House. Actually, I think we have a few notes from,
I have a neat thing that Mrs. Obama said when Nancy Reagan died about Nancy Reagan, that Mrs. Reagan was a woman of incredible strength and grace, and she was a passionate advocate for so many important issues. Through the examples she set both during her time in the White House and beyond, Mrs. Reagan reminded us of the importance of women's leadership at every level of our society. And on a personal note, Mrs. Reagan also understood the value of mentoring.
Wow.
mentoring,
Well,
which is important.
we are out of time, and I can't think of any better way to conclude such a robust and thoughtful discussion about remembering
Thank
the
you,
first
David.
ladies than with that quote from Mrs. Obama about Mrs. Reagan. So thank you.
Yes.
Please join me in thanking our amazing authors.
Thank you all.